It was a chilly autumn evening when my Aunt Mary and her family moved into an old Victorian style house in a quiet neighborhood. The house had been empty for years, with peeling paint and dusty windows. Despite its worn out look, the house had a charm that attracted my aunt. She and her husband David saw it as a place where they could raise their two kids, Emily and John. The family spent weeks fixing up the house, painting the walls, and replacing old floorboards. But there was one room they didn't touch, a small locked attic. They didn't have the key, and the realtor had said it probably just contained old junk. One day, while cleaning the basement, David found an old rusty key hidden behind a loose brick in the wall. Curious, he went up to the attic. The key fit the lock, and the door opened to reveal a dusty room full of old furniture and forgotten things. Among the dusty boxes was a small wooden chest with strange carvings. The chest was locked, but David forced it open with a crowbar. Inside, wrapped in a faded cloth, was a porcelain doll. The doll was beautiful, with delicate features, glassy blue eyes, and long blonde hair. Its dress was made of fine lace, though it had turned yellow with age. David thought it was just an old doll from Victorian times, so he decided to give it to Emily. Emily was thrilled with the doll. She named it Lily and took it everywhere. She would sit for hours playing with Lily, talking to it and brushing its hair. Mary noticed Emily's growing attachment to the doll but didn't worry much. However, strange things began happening in the house. Objects would move on their own, doors would creak open, and cold drafts would appear out of nowhere. Mary often woke up feeling like someone was watching her, but she never found anyone there. One night, Emily woke up screaming. When Mary and David rushed into her room, they found her crying and pointing at Lily, who was sitting on the windowsill, looking as if it were watching Emily. She is alive! Emily cried. Lily is alive, and she wants to hurt me. Mary tried to comfort her, saying it was just a bad dream, but Emily insisted that Lily had moved on its own and whispered terrible things in the dark. David suggested getting rid of the doll, but Emily begged them not to. Even though she was scared, she didn't want to lose Lily. The next few days were tense. Emily refused to sleep in her room, and the strange occurrences in the house increased. Mary began hearing whispers at night and sometimes saw things moving out of the corner of her eye. One evening, as the family sat down to dinner, the lights suddenly flickered and went out, plunging the house into darkness. Footsteps echoed through the hallway. David grabbed a flashlight, but there was no one there. The air grew thick with a chilling, ominous feeling. In the dim light, Mary noticed that Lily was no longer on the mantel where Emily had left her. Panic set in as they realized the doll was missing. They searched the house, but Lily was nowhere to be found. Emily was hysterical, sure that Lily was coming for her. That night, as the family huddled together in the living room, they heard a child's laughter echoing through the halls. The laughter was followed by footsteps, getting closer and louder. Suddenly, the door to the living room swung open, and there stood Lily, her glassy eyes shining in the dark. Her once beautiful face now had a twisted, creepy grin. The doll moved toward them, its small feet tapping on the floor. David grabbed a fire poker and swung at the doll, but it dodged the blow with unnatural speed. The doll jumped at him, biting his hand with sharp teeth that had somehow appeared. David screamed in pain, dropping the poker as blood dripped from his hand. Mary grabbed Emily and John, pulling them toward the door. But the doll was faster. It jumped onto Mary's back, wrapping his tiny hands around her throat. Mary gasped for breath, struggling to get the doll off, but it was no use. The doll's grip tightened, and Mary felt herself losing consciousness. Just as she was about to pass out, David managed to grab the doll and throw it across the room. The doll hit the wall, and its porcelain head shattered into pieces. But even after it was broken, the sinister presence in the house remained. The family fled the house that night, leaving everything behind. They never spoke of the incident again, but the memory haunted them. Emily refused to speak for months, traumatized by what had happened. Even years later, she would wake up screaming, convinced that Lily was still out there waiting for her. The house was eventually sold to another family, The family that bought the house, a young couple named Mark and Sarah, with their teenage son Ethan, knew nothing about its dark history. They were simply excited to have found a home with so much character at such a reasonable price. The realtor had mentioned that the previous owners had left in a hurry but hadn't provided any details. Mark and Sarah didn't ask many questions. They were too thrilled with their new beginning to think twice. The first few days in the house were peaceful. They spent their time unpacking and getting to know their new home. The house was old and had its traits, but they loved its charm. The creaky floorboards, the old fashioned fixtures, the large overgrown garden in the back. Ethan, however, felt a chill in his room, even when the windows were closed and the heat was on. It was an unsettling coldness that seemed to seep into his bones. He brushed it off as a draft, or maybe nerves from moving to a new place. But things began to change quickly. On their third night in the house, Ethan was awakened by a soft rhythmic tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of the wind rustling through the trees outside. He sat up in bed, listening, trying to pin out the source. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to be coming from the walls. Ethan's heart raced. He got up and pressed his ear against the cold plaster wall. Tap, tap, tap. He told his parents the next morning, but they dismissed it. As the house settling, old houses make noises, Sarah said, smiling, trying to reassure him. You'll get used to it, Mark agreed, saying, it's probably just a raccoon or something in the walls. I'll check it out this weekend. But Ethan wasn't convinced. The sound hadn't felt like an animal, it had felt deliberate. That evening, while they were having dinner, the lights flickered and then went out, plunging the house into darkness. Probably a blown fuse, Mark sat calmly, getting up to check the breaker as he left the dining room. Sarah lit a candle, its flickering light casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Ethan watched these shadows, his eyes wide, his heart pounding, and then he saw it, a shape in the corner of the room, darker than the rest, moving toward them. Mom, he whispered, his voice trembling. Do you see that? Sarah turned to look, but the shadows was gone. See what, honey? She asked. Ethan shook his head. Nothing. He muttered. It's nothing. But he knew it wasn't nothing. He had seen something or someone. Mark returned, the lights flickering back on as he did. Just a loose wire, he said, but Ethan wasn't listening. He couldn't shake the image of that shadow creeping toward them. He felt a chill run down his spine. That night, he had trouble falling asleep. Every creak, every rustle made him jump. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling until finally exhaustion overtook him. He was awakened again by the tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It was louder this time, more insistent. He sat up, his heart racing. The room was cold, colder than before. He could see his breath in the air. He heard a whisper, faint but clear, Ethan. His blood ran cold. He looked around. The voice came again, louder this time, more urgent. He jumped out of bed and ran to his parents' room. There's someone in my room, he cried, banging on their door. Mark opened the door, looking groggy and annoyed. Ethan, it's the middle of the night. What are you talking about? There's someone in my room. Ethan repeated, his voice shaking. I heard them. They said my name. Sarah got out of bed, looking worried. Honey, are you sure? She asked gently. Ethan nodded. I'm sure. Please come see. They followed him back to his room, but there was no one there. Mark checked the windows. They were all locked. He checked the closet and under the bed. Nothing. See, he said. There's no one here. You must have had a bad dream. Ethan shook his head. It wasn't a dream. I know what I heard. Sarah hugged him. It's okay, sweetie. You can sleep in our room tonight if you want. Ethan nodded, too scared to argue. But things only got worse from there. The next morning, they found strange markings on the walls. Deep, jagged scratches, like claw marks. What could have done this? Sarah asked, horrified. Mark frowned, running his hand over the marks. I don't know, he said slowly. Maybe a wild animal got it somehow? But Ethan knew better. He could feel it. The house was angry. Over the next few days, the activity escalated. They heard footsteps in the hallways at night, doors slamming shut on their own, and objects moving by themselves. The air grew colder, heavier, filled with a sense of dread. Sarah began to see things, a figure in a white dress standing at the foot of her bed, a child's laughter echoing through the halls. Mark dismissed it as a stress. But Ethan knew she was seeing Lily, the same ghost that had haunted the previous family. One night, Mark decided he would had enough. We are getting out of here, he said, packing their bags. I don't know what's going on, but we are not saying to find out. But as they tried to leave, the front door slammed shut, locking them inside. The windows wouldn't open. The house groaned and creaked, as if alive. The lights flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. Everyone stay close, Mark shouted. Grabbing a flashlight, they huddled together in the living room. They are thick with fear. And then they heard it, the tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from all around them, louder and louder, until it was deafening. What is that? Sarah cried, covering her ears. I don't know. Mark replied, his voice shaking, but we need to get out of here now. They ran from the back door, but it too was locked. They were trapped. The tapping grew louder, more frantic, and then it stopped. For a moment, there was silence, and then a voice, a whisper, soft but clear. Get out, it said. Get out now. Mark shined the flashlight around, but there was no one there. Who are you? He shouted. What do you want? But there was no answer, only silence, and then, without warning, the house erupted into chaos. Furniture flew across the room, smashing into walls. Pictures fell from the walls, shattering on the floor. The tapping started again, louder and faster, as if something was pounding on the walls, trying to get in. Sarah screamed as she was lifted off her feet and thrown across the room. Mark tried to grab her, but something invisible yanked him back. Ethan walked in horror as his parents were tossed around like rag dolls, their screams filling the air. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The house fell silent. Ethan looked around, his heart pounding. His parents lay motionless on the floor, their bodies broken and twisted. Mom, Dad, he whispered, but they didn't move. Tears streamed down his face as he realized they were gone. He was alone. He heard a soft whisper behind him. Ethan. He turned slowly, his breath catching his throat. There, standing in the doorway, was a little girl in a white dress, her eyes dark and hollow. Lily, he whispered. She smiled, a cold, empty smile. Come play with me, she said, reaching out a hand. Ethan shook his head, backing away. No, he whispered, leave me alone. But she just kept smiling, her hand outstretched. Come play with me, Ethan, she repeated. He turned and ran, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't stop until he was out of the house, into the woods behind it. He ran and ran until he couldn't run anymore. He collapsed to the ground. Sobbing, the image of Lily's dark eyes burned into his mind. He knew he could never go back to that house. He knew he could never escape it. It would haunt him forever. The house stood empty after that, its windows boarded up, its doors locked tight. No one ever moved in again. But sometimes, late at night, neighbors would hear a soft tapping coming from inside and a child's voice whispering in the darkness.